After more than 40 years sitting on this bench, I honestly thought I had seen every kind of case a courtroom could offer. I've seen anger, excuses, arrogance, and tears that felt rehearsed. But the morning an elderly veteran walked into my courtroom, leaning on a cane and holding a stack of medical papers, I felt something shift inside me before he even spoke. I remember thinking to myself, this isn't just another case. And by the time I made my decision, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, including mine. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because it reminded me why I still put on these robes after all these years. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for over 40 years now, and every morning starts the same way for me. I wake up early, usually before the sun, because old habits don't leave you once they're in your bones. I have my coffee strong and black, no sugar, no cream. Christina, my clerk, knows exactly how I like it, but I make it at home anyway. It gives me time to think. I sit at my kitchen table and read the paper the old-fashioned way. My wife always tells me I should use a tablet, but I like the feel of newsprint in my hands. It reminds me of my father. He came to this country from Italy with nothing but hope and a work ethic, and every morning he read the paper before work, like it was a promise to stay informed and honest. My father taught me early that respect isn't optional. He used to say, "Frank, how you treat people when you have power tells me everything I need to know about you." Those words followed me into this courtroom and stayed with me every single day. By 8:15 every morning, I'm walking through the courthouse doors. I've been doing that since the mid-'80s, and I still feel a sense of responsibility every time I step inside. This building isn't just stone and wood to me. It's where people come on their worst days, and I never forget that. That particular morning felt quiet, almost too quiet. I remember noticing the sound of my shoes echoing down the hallway. Christina greeted me like she always does, smiling, handing me my coffee, telling me what the docket looked like for the day. I thanked her, took a sip, and felt that familiar bitterness settle me. I went through my case files slowly. Parking violations, minor infractions, things people often brush off as unimportant, but I never see them that way. To the person standing in front of me, that case might mean everything. As I sat there flipping through papers, I felt something I've learned to trust over the years, a quiet instinct, a feeling that told me to pay attention today. I couldn't explain it, but I've learned not to ignore that voice. When court started, the first few cases went exactly as you'd expect. People rushing, apologizing, making excuses. I listened. I ruled. I reminded myself, as I always do, that everyone deserves to be heard. Then Christina called the next case. I looked up, and that's when I saw him. I watched as an elderly man slowly made his way toward the podium. I noticed the cane first. He leaned on it heavily, like every step required intention. His back was slightly hunched, and his movements were careful, measured. I could tell immediately that standing there wasn't easy for him. I saw him clutching a manila folder thick with papers. Medical records, I guessed. I've seen enough of them over the years to recognize that weight, both physical and emotional. I remember thinking about my own father in that moment, how he walked later in life, how pride kept him standing even when his body told him to sit. I asked him to take his time. I always do, but with him, I meant it more than usual. I said to him, "Sir, there's no rush here. You're safe." He looked up at me, and when our eyes met, I saw something I don't see often anymore. Quiet dignity. He told me his name, his voice steady but tired. I could hear the strain in it, like each word cost him something. I asked him what brought him to my courtroom that day. He took a breath, adjusted his grip on the cane, and began to explain. He told me about the ticket, a minor violation, something that on paper looked simple. But as he spoke, I realized this wasn't really about the fine. He explained that he had tried to comply, that he had done his best. I watched his hands as he spoke. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age and illness. I noticed the room had gone quiet. People sensed something important was happening. Then he mentioned his service. I didn't interrupt him. I never do when someone starts talking about that part of their life. He told me about the years he served, the places he went, the things he carried home with him that no one could see. He didn't brag, he didn't dramatize it, he just stated facts. I felt my throat tighten. I've presided over thousands of cases, but when someone stands before me who has given years of their life to this country, I listen differently, not because the law changes, but because context matters. He opened the folder and handed over the papers, medical records, doctor's notes, evidence of a body that had paid its dues. I picked them up and looked through them carefully. I always do. Every page told a story of pain, persistence, and resilience. As I read, I could smell the faint scent of antiseptic on the paper. Hospitals have a smell that never really leaves you. It reminded me of visits I've made with family members over the years, long hallways, hard chairs, waiting. I looked back at him and asked a simple question. I asked him how he was doing, not legally, not procedurally, just as a human being. He paused before answering. That pause told me more than words ever could. He said he was doing the best he could. That's when I felt it. That shift in the room, the kind you can't manufacture, the kind that reminds you why justice isn't just about rules, but about people. I thought about my own routine, my warm coffee, my comfortable chair, and I thought about the path that had led him here, standing with a cane, papers in hand, waiting for someone to listen. I knew then that this case was going to stay with me, and I want you to stay with me too, because what happened next and how this day unfolded says something important about respect, service, and what justice really means. I remember standing there behind my bench, looking at this man and feeling the weight of everything he had just placed in front of me without asking for sympathy. I've learned over the years that people who truly carry burdens rarely announce them. They just show up and do their best. That's exactly what he was doing in my courtroom that morning. I asked him a few more questions, slowly and clearly, so he wouldn't feel rushed. I asked him about his health, not to pry, but to understand. He told me about the surgeries, the medications, the appointments that seemed to fill his calendar more than anything else these days. I listened carefully, because listening is sometimes the most important thing a judge can do. As he spoke, I noticed how carefully he chose his words. He wasn't trying to impress me. He wasn't trying to manipulate the system. He was just explaining his reality. I could hear the fatigue in his voice, the kind that settles in when pain becomes part of your daily routine. I looked around my courtroom and saw people leaning forward in their seats. Phones were down. Whispers had stopped. Everyone felt it. Moments like that don't happen often, but when they do, you can almost hear the room breathing together. I asked him about the day he received the ticket. I wanted to understand the circumstances, not just the violation. He explained how difficult it was for him to move quickly, how even small physical tasks now required planning. He told me he never intended to break the law. He said that if he could go back, he would do everything differently. I believed him. I've spent decades listening to excuses, and I can tell you this plainly. There's a difference between an excuse and an explanation. One avoids responsibility, the other provides context. This man wasn't running from anything. I thought about something my mentor once told me early in my career. He said, "Frank, justice without compassion is just punishment in a robe." Those words stayed with me as I looked at the papers in front of me, and then back at the man holding himself upright with everything he had. I asked him one more question. I asked him why he brought all those medical papers with him. He looked a little embarrassed, like he hadn't planned to talk about that. He said he wasn't trying to get out of anything. He just wanted me to understand why things weren't as simple for him anymore. That answer hit me hard. I've seen people come into my courtroom with stacks of documents, photos, charts, anything they think might help them win. But this felt different. This felt like someone saying, "Please see me." I took a moment. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes, not because I was tired, but because I needed a second to steady myself. I could feel emotion rising, and I've learned that when that happens, you slow down, you breathe, you make sure your decisions come from clarity, not impulse. I told him to hold on while I reviewed everything carefully. I read each page. I didn't skim. I didn't rush. Every detail mattered. The room stayed silent, and I could feel the respect in that silence. As I read, memories came flooding back. I thought about my father's hands after a lifetime of hard work. I thought about veterans I had met over the years, men and women who carried themselves with quiet strength long after their uniforms were put away. I thought about how often society thanks them in words but forgets them in action. When I looked up again, he was standing exactly where I left him, cane planted firmly, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward. He didn't look nervous, he looked patient, like someone who had learned long ago that waiting was part of life. I asked him about his family. He told me about his wife. He spoke about her with warmth, the kind that doesn't fade with time. He told me how she helped him on the hard days, how she reminded him to keep going even when he felt like sitting down. I could hear love in his voice, and I could also hear fear. Fear of being a burden, fear of being misunderstood, fear that asking for understanding might be seen as weakness. I want you to understand something here. In my courtroom, the law matters deeply, but so does humanity. The challenge is finding the balance between the two. I explained the nature of the fine to him. I explained what the law required. I made sure he understood everything clearly. He nodded the whole time, never interrupting, never arguing. When I finished, he simply said he understood and that he would accept whatever decision I made. That kind of acceptance is rare. I felt the room waiting. I felt Christina glance at me, already sensing that this case was different. I could smell my coffee cooling beside me, forgotten. I leaned forward slightly and looked directly at him. I told him that his service mattered. I said it plainly, not as a performance, but as a truth. I told him that the sacrifices he made didn't disappear just because time passed. I saw his eyes soften when I said that. I paused again, because sometimes silence speaks louder than rulings. I wanted him to know that this wasn't just procedure. This was recognition. I thought about how many times people like him had stood quietly in the background while the world moved on. I thought about how often respect is talked about but rarely shown in meaningful ways. I made my decision. I told him that I was going to waive the fine. The reaction wasn't loud at first. It was subtle, a collective exhale. I saw his grip on the cane loosen slightly. I saw his shoulders drop just a bit, like he had been holding tension for years and was finally allowed to release some of it. He looked at me, stunned. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice cracked. He thanked me, but not in a dramatic way. Just two simple words that carried a lifetime of meaning. I told him that his responsibility to this country had already been paid many times over. I told him that sometimes justice means understanding when the law has already been fulfilled through sacrifice. Tears filled his eyes, and I felt my own vision blur for a moment. I'm not ashamed to admit that. After 4 decades on this bench, moments like that still get to me. As he turned to leave, slowly and carefully, I watched everyone in my courtroom stand up without being asked. That doesn't happen often. No one told them to do it. They just did. I watched him pause, surprised, and then nod quietly, accepting that respect with the same dignity he brought in with him. And as he walked out, leaning on that cane, I knew this day wasn't over yet. I had a feeling deep in my gut that what followed would test my patience, my composure, and my belief in fairness in a very different way. Stay with me, because the next person who entered my courtroom couldn't have been more different, and the contrast between the two changed everything. I sat back in my chair after he left, and I let myself feel that moment for just a second. I've learned that if you don't allow yourself to feel the weight of a case like that, you start turning people into paperwork. I never wanted that to happen to me. I took a slow breath, straightened the papers on my desk, and nodded to Christina to call the next case. That's when the energy in my courtroom changed. I didn't hear footsteps at first. What I heard was a laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the quiet. I remember thinking to myself that laughter doesn't belong in moments like this. I looked up instinctively, and my eyes went to the back of the courtroom. I saw her sitting there with her legs crossed, scrolling on her phone like she was waiting for a table at a restaurant. I noticed the way she was dressed before I noticed anything else. Designer shoes, expensive handbag resting on the seat beside her like it deserved its own space. Everything about her posture said impatience. I felt my jaw tighten. I've seen confidence before. I've seen wealth. Neither of those things bother me. But entitlement has a smell to it, and it doesn't take long to recognize. I could feel it drifting forward like a draft. Christina called her case. I watched as she stood up slowly, clearly annoyed, and walked toward the podium. She didn't rush. She didn't look around. She didn't acknowledge anyone else in the room. I remember thinking how different her walk was from the man who had just left. No cane, no hesitation, just irritation. I looked down at the file in front of me. It was a minor charge on paper, the kind of case that usually takes less than a minute. But something told me this wasn't going to be simple. I asked her to state her name. She did, without looking at me, still tapping on her phone. I had to clear my throat to get her attention. I don't do that often, but respect starts with awareness. I asked her to put the phone away. She sighed like I had just asked her to do something unreasonable. I felt my blood pressure rise, and I'm not going to lie about that. But I kept my voice steady. I always do. I explained the charge. I explained why she was there. I asked her if she understood. She laughed again, louder this time, and shook her head. She said she couldn't believe she had to be there for something so small. She said she had meetings to attend, lunch plans, a schedule that apparently mattered more than anyone else's time. I looked at her and thought about the man with the cane. I thought about how carefully he chose his words. I thought about how he thanked me for listening. I asked her what happened that day. She waved her hand dismissively and said it was a misunderstanding. She said she could pay whatever fine it was and be done with it. That's when I leaned forward. I told her that this wasn't a drive-through. I told her this was a court of law. I could hear the room tighten again, like everyone sensed where this was going. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and said something I'll never forget. She said, and I quote, "Your Honor, I spend more on shoes than whatever this fine is." I heard a murmur ripple through the courtroom. I saw Christina close her eyes for a brief second and then open them again, professional as ever. I felt a familiar frustration rise in my chest. I had to pause. I literally had to stop and take a breath. I've learned that when someone tries to bait you with arrogance, the worst thing you can do is take the bait. I reminded myself of that as I removed my glasses and set them carefully on the bench. I told her that money might make life comfortable, but it doesn't buy respect in my courtroom. I told her that everyone who stands before me is equal, whether they arrive with a cane and medical papers or a designer handbag and an attitude. She rolled her eyes. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, disappointment. That's often worse. I thought about my father's words again. How you treat people when you have power tells me everything I need to know about you. I asked her if she had anything else she wanted to say in her defense. She shrugged and said no. She said she just wanted this over with. I looked down at the file again, but this time I wasn't just reading charges. I was reading character. And I want you to understand something here. Character always reveals itself eventually. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it shouts. In this case, it was shouting. I began to speak, choosing my words carefully, because moments like this matter. I told her that fines aren't just numbers. They represent accountability. They represent respect for the rules that keep society functioning. She interrupted me. She said I was making a big deal out of nothing. That's when I stopped her. I raised my hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to regain control of my courtroom. I told her that interruptions weren't acceptable. I told her that listening was part of the process, whether she liked it or not. I could feel the tension stretching. Time seemed to slow down. I remember thinking to myself, this isn't going to end the way she thinks it will. And before I go any further, let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who thinks rules don't apply to them? Someone who believes money solves everything? Leave me a comment, because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. I continued. I asked her if she was aware of the seriousness of showing disrespect in a court of law. She smirked and said she didn't see what the big deal was. That smirk stayed with me. It wasn't confidence, it was dismissal. I thought about how quickly situations can turn when people underestimate where they are. I've seen it hundreds of times. People walk in thinking they're untouchable, only to realize too late that accountability doesn't care about status. I told her that I was giving her one opportunity to explain herself properly. I told her to take a breath and speak respectfully. For a moment, I thought she might. For a moment, I saw hesitation. Then she doubled down. She said she had never been treated like this before. She said people usually handled things differently when they knew who she was. I felt my eyebrows rise slightly at that. I asked her what she meant. She smiled and said she had resources. That word hung in the air, resources. I leaned back in my chair again, feeling the weight of the contrast between the cases I had just heard. On one side, a man who gave years of his life without asking for anything in return. On the other, someone who believed comfort was a shield. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence do its work. Silence can be very instructive if you allow it. I looked at Christina. She looked back at me, already sensing that this case was going somewhere unexpected. I looked back at the defendant and told her that in my courtroom, resources don't outweigh responsibility. She scoffed. That scoff told me everything. And that's when something happened that I didn't anticipate. Something that would turn this routine case into one of the most unforgettable days of my career. I didn't see it coming then, but I was about to learn that arrogance often blinds people to what's standing right behind them. Stay with me, because what happened next changed the direction of this case, and honestly, it changed the room all over again. I remember sitting there, looking at her scoff, and feeling that quiet alarm go off in my head. It's the same feeling I've had before when I knew a situation was about to shift, not explode, not collapse, but turn. I didn't know how yet, but my instincts were telling me to slow everything down and pay attention. I asked her one last time if she wanted to add anything to her statement. I kept my voice calm, almost softer than before. I've learned that lowering your voice sometimes carries more authority than raising it. She crossed her arms and said she had nothing else to say. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I saw a man stand up from the gallery. He wasn't dressed like most people who wander into my courtroom. He wore a dark suit, simple, well-fitted, no flash. He stood straight, hands at his sides, and waited. He didn't speak until I acknowledged him. I remember thinking, that's interesting. I asked him to identify himself. He did so respectfully. He told me he was an assistant United States attorney. I felt the room react before I did. You could almost hear the shift in posture from everyone sitting there. I looked at Christina. She looked back at me with raised eyebrows. That doesn't happen often. She's seen just about everything with me. The man asked if he could approach. I nodded. I always give people the opportunity to speak if it's appropriate, and something told me this was very appropriate. He walked forward and handed Christina a sealed envelope. I watched her take it, her expression changing slightly, as she glanced at the return information. She handed it to me without a word. I held the envelope in my hands and felt its weight. Not physical weight, importance. I remember thinking to myself, this just got a lot bigger than a parking ticket. I opened it slowly. I didn't rush. I never rush when something feels significant. Inside were documents that immediately caught my attention, names, numbers, references that didn't belong in a local courtroom on a quiet morning. I felt my heartbeat change. I read carefully, making sure I understood exactly what I was seeing. In over 40 years on this bench, I've learned that clarity matters more than speed. The room was completely silent, no coughing, no shuffling, nothing. As I read, I felt genuine shock rise in me, not outrage, shock. I remember thinking, I've never seen this unfold like this before. I looked up at the assistant U.S. attorney and asked him to explain. He did, calmly and clearly. He said his office had been conducting an ongoing investigation. He said the individual standing before me was connected to it. He chose his words carefully, the way professionals do when they know every word matters. I glanced back at her. She was still standing there, arms crossed, but something had changed. I saw it immediately. Her confidence wasn't gone yet, but it was cracking. Her eyes flicked between me and the man behind her. I listened as he continued. He explained that they had been waiting for the right moment to formally serve notice. He said that her presence in my courtroom that morning had created that moment. I felt a chill move through me. I asked him if this was related to the matter currently before the court. He said no. He said it was far more serious, federal serious. I want you to understand something here. When you've been a judge as long as I have, you learn to read people quickly. I watched her face as he spoke. I watched the color slowly drain from it. The same person who had laughed minutes earlier now stood frozen. I took a deep breath. I had to. I could feel the magnitude of what was happening, and I knew the room could feel it too. Time seemed to slow down again, just like it does before something irreversible happens. I asked the assistant U.S. attorney if there were pending charges. He said yes. He said multiple. He said they involved financial misconduct on a scale that made my stomach tighten. I looked down at the papers again, then back at her. I thought about the word she had used earlier, resources. I told her to listen carefully. I told her that this courtroom was about to become the least of her concerns. I didn't say it with anger. I said it with clarity. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. I saw her swallow hard. Her hands, the same hands that had casually waved off the fine earlier, were now trembling. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction wasn't one of them. What I felt was gravity. This was serious. This was real. Before I go any further, I want to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. If you've ever felt that frustration watching someone disrespect something important, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, I never saw coming in my entire career. I asked the assistant U.S. attorney to clarify whether my court still had jurisdiction over the original charge. He said it was up to me, but given the circumstances, the federal matter would take precedence. I nodded slowly. I could feel every set of eyes in the room on me. Moments like this define a courtroom, not the paperwork, not the routine. Moments like this. I turned my attention back to her. I told her that earlier she had laughed. I reminded her of that. I reminded her of how she dismissed the process, the people, the room. She looked at me then with something new in her eyes. Fear. I've seen fear many times, but this was different. This wasn't fear of a fine. This was fear of consequences she couldn't pay her way out of. She tried to speak. Her voice came out unsteady. She asked what this meant. I told her that it meant accountability had finally caught up. I thought about the veteran again, about how he had stood there quietly, accepting whatever came his way. I thought about how two people could walk into the same courtroom on the same day and reveal everything about who they were without meaning to. I told her that wealth can delay reality, but it can't erase it. I told her that character is revealed under pressure, and pressure had arrived. The assistant U.S. attorney asked for permission to proceed. I granted it. At that moment, this was no longer a hypothetical situation. This was happening. I watched her shoulders sag. I watched her carefully place her handbag on the floor, like it suddenly didn't matter anymore. I watched the illusion fall apart piece by piece. And I want you to stay with me, because what happened in the next few minutes was something I'll never forget. It was the moment when arrogance gave way to fear, and when justice began to move in a way that can't be stopped. I watched her stand there, silent now, and I could almost see the thoughts racing behind her eyes. Just minutes earlier, she had treated my courtroom like an inconvenience. Now she was realizing that inconvenience had turned into something far more permanent. I've seen that realization before, but it never looks the same twice. The Assistant United States Attorney spoke again, calmly explaining the nature of the federal charges without dramatics. He didn't need to. The words carried enough weight on their own. Fraud, misrepresentation, long-term investigation. Each word landed heavier than the last. I felt the room lean in. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Even the air felt thick. I looked at her hands again. They were shaking openly now. Not a subtle tremor like before. This was visible, uncontrolled. The same hands that had dismissed responsibility were now betraying her fear. She finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She asked if there had been a mistake. I didn't answer right away. I let the Assistant U.S. Attorney respond. He told her very clearly that there was no mistake. I leaned forward and removed my glasses again. I do that when I want someone to understand that I'm speaking plainly, not formally. I told her that earlier she had asked why this was such a big deal. I told her this was why. I said to her, money can buy comfort, and it can buy silence for a while, but it can't buy immunity. I've learned that in 40 years on this bench. Her eyes filled with tears. That surprised some people in the room, but it didn't surprise me. Fear has a way of stripping people down to their most honest state. This was the first honest emotion I had seen from her all morning. She looked around the room like she was seeing it for the first time. The wooden benches, the seal behind me, the people watching. She wasn't above it anymore. She was inside it. I asked the Assistant U.S. Attorney if federal agents were present. He nodded. I saw 2 individuals stand quietly near the side entrance. They had been there the whole time, waiting. I remember thinking how often consequences are closer than people realize. Before anything else happened, I spoke directly to her again. I told her that earlier she had compared a fine to her spending habits. I reminded her of that exact sentence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I said to her, 2 hours ago you laughed in this courtroom. You rolled your eyes at the process. You disrespected the people around you. And now you're standing here realizing that none of that protected you. Tears spilled down her face. She nodded slowly. I could tell she wanted to speak, to explain, to bargain. But some moments don't allow for bargaining anymore. That's when the agent stepped forward. I watched as they approached her. I'll never forget the sound of the handcuffs. It's a sound you don't mistake for anything else. Sharp, final. The designer handbag she had placed so carefully on the floor tipped over and spilled open. Nobody moved to pick it up. I felt a strange stillness settle over the room. I thought about the veteran again, about how gently he had held his papers, about how he had accepted responsibility without argument. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I watched her shoulders slump as the agents guided her toward the exit. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't speaking. She was just walking, head down, illusion gone. As she passed the benches, I saw people's expressions. There was no celebration, no satisfaction, just a quiet understanding that accountability had arrived exactly when it was supposed to. I leaned back in my chair and felt the weight of the moment settle in my chest. This is why I tell people that justice isn't about winning or losing. It's about truth eventually finding its way to the surface. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these, seeing that the law really does apply to everyone equally. If this story is restoring your faith in justice, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to see it. After the courtroom cleared, I sat there for a few minutes longer than usual. Christina didn't rush me. She never does. She knows when I need time. I stared at the empty podium and thought about how two people could stand in the same place on the same day and leave with completely different outcomes. Later that afternoon, the assistant U.S. attorney came to my chambers. He explained more details about the investigation. I learned that it had been ongoing for years. The numbers were staggering, millions of dollars, layered transactions, a trail that took patience and persistence to uncover. I sat there listening, thinking about how close she had come to walking away with nothing more than a fine, if not for her own behavior. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Character reveals itself under pressure. As he spoke, I thought about how often people underestimate the consequences of disrespect, not just toward the law, but toward others. Disrespect has a way of circling back. After he left, I sat alone for a while. I thought about my father, about how he taught me that fairness isn't about favor. It's about consistency. Treat everyone the same, and the truth has nowhere to hide. 2 months later, I received a letter. It was addressed to my chambers. The return address caught my attention immediately. It was from her, from federal custody. I almost didn't open it. Judges don't often receive letters like that, but something told me to read it. She wrote that she never understood what respect really meant until she lost everything she thought defined her. She wrote that standing in my courtroom had been the first time she felt truly powerless, and that powerlessness forced her to see herself clearly. I set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. I thought about whether people can change. I've seen some do it. I've seen others pretend. I don't know what her future holds. That part isn't up to me. But I do know this. 3 days after the arrest, the veteran returned to the courthouse. He didn't have to. He just wanted to say thank you again. He stood in my doorway, cane in hand, and told me that being heard had meant more to him than the fine ever did. A year later, I learned that recovered funds from the investigation help support community programs, including assistance for veterans. And the first scholarship awarded through that program went to the daughter of a nurse who had been struggling to pay for school. When I heard that, tears came to my eyes. I think about that day often, about what it taught me. After all these years, I still believe the law is the great equalizer. Money can't buy integrity, it can't buy respect. And in the end, justice has a way of finding its moment. Stay with me, because in the final parts, I want to reflect on what this day truly meant to me and why stories like this still matter more than ever. After that day, I found myself replaying the moments over and over in my mind. Not just the arrest or the contrast between the two cases, but the quiet details people don't always notice, the pauses, the expressions, the way a room can change when truth finally walks in without knocking. That evening when I got home, my wife could tell right away that it had been a heavy day. After 48 years of marriage, she doesn't need words. She looked at me across the dinner table and asked if I was all right. I told her I was, but that I had been reminded of something important. She nodded, because she knows what that means. Some days on the bench don't end when you leave the courthouse. Later that night, I sat in my chair and thought about the veteran again. I thought about how he stood there, cane steady, papers neatly organized, not asking for special treatment. I thought about how much strength it takes to show up when your body is telling you not to. There's a courage in that kind of perseverance that doesn't get enough recognition. I remembered something my father used to tell me when I was young. He said that real honor isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up and does the work. That man embodied that lesson in a way that stayed with me. The next morning I was back at the courthouse at 8:15, just like always. Christina handed me my coffee and gave me a look that told me she had been thinking about the day before, too. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. Some moments speak for themselves. As the days went on, pieces of the federal case continued to come to light through official channels. I learned more about how carefully the investigation had been built, how long people had waited, how many chances the truth had been given to surface voluntarily. It hadn't, so it forced its way in. I thought about how often people confuse delay with escape. Just because consequences don't arrive immediately doesn't mean they aren't coming. I've seen that lesson play out countless times, but it never loses its power. A few weeks later, I received another update about the veteran. A clerk mentioned that he had written a thank you note to the courthouse staff, not just to me, to everyone. Security, clerks, people who often go unnoticed. That detail mattered to me. Gratitude, when it's genuine, spreads outward. I sat with that thought for a while, about how gratitude and entitlement sit on opposite ends of the same spectrum. One builds bridges, the other burns them. I also thought about the woman who had been arrested, about the letter she wrote. I didn't share it with anyone. That was between her and me. Judges see people at their best and their worst, and sometimes at their most honest. That letter felt honest. Whether that honesty would lead to change, only time will tell. I don't believe in writing people off completely. I believe in accountability paired with the possibility of growth. But growth starts with humility, and humility can't exist where entitlement lives. One afternoon, a few months later, I was walking through the courthouse hallway when someone stopped me. It was a young man, nervous, respectful. He told me he had been in the courtroom that day. He said watching those two cases back to back had changed the way he looked at responsibility. He said it made him think about how he treated people when no one was forcing him to be kind. That meant more to me than he probably realized. You see, people think judges measure success in convictions or rulings. I don't. I measure it in moments where someone walks away thinking differently than they did before. As time went on, life returned to its normal rhythm. New cases, new faces, new stories. But that day stayed with me. It stayed with me because it captured something essential about justice that can't be written into statutes. Justice isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about recognizing humanity without abandoning responsibility. I thought again about the veteran's daughter, about the scholarship, about how the ripple effects of accountability can sometimes do real good when handled correctly. That's something people don't talk about enough. Justice, when done right, doesn't just punish, it restores balance. Before I wrap this story up, let me ask you something. Do you think wealth should protect someone from consequences? Should money put you above the law? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you believe everyone should be equal under the law like I do, hit that subscribe button. I've said this many times, but it's worth repeating. In my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground, and that's how it should be. The law doesn't bend for comfort, it stands for fairness. I still think about the sound of those handcuffs, not because of satisfaction, but because of finality. A chapter closed, a lesson delivered, and I still think about the sound of that cane tapping softly on the floor as the veteran walked out. That sound meant resilience, survival, quiet honor. Those two sounds echo very differently in my memory. As I look back on that day now, I realize it wasn't just about waiving a fine or witnessing an arrest. It was about contrast, about who we choose to be when no one owes us anything, about how we treat systems meant to protect everyone, not just the comfortable. I've learned one thing in 40 years. The law doesn't care about your bank account. It cares about your actions. And when your actions finally catch up with you, there's nowhere left to hide. In the final part, I want to share what this day ultimately taught me about justice, respect, and why I still believe so deeply in this system, even after everything I've seen. Stay with me. I think about that day more often than people might expect. After 40 years on this bench, you'd think moments would blur together, but some days refuse to fade. They stay sharp. They stay present. That day did exactly that because it reminded me why this work still matters to me so deeply. I grew up watching my father work with his hands. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for shortcuts. He believed that dignity came from doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. When I put on these robes every morning, I carry that lesson with me. I don't see myself as above anyone who stands in front of me. I see myself as responsible to them. The veteran understood that without saying it. He didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't demand recognition. He simply showed up, did his best, and trusted the process. That kind of trust is fragile. It's earned slowly, and it can be broken quickly. That's why I take it so seriously. When I waived his fine, I didn't do it because I felt sorry for him. I did it because justice had already been served in ways far deeper than a citation could capture. His service, his sacrifices, his resilience, those things mattered. Honoring them mattered. And I want to be clear about something. Mercy isn't weakness. Mercy is judgment paired with understanding. It's knowing when the purpose of the law has already been fulfilled. I've been asked before if decisions like that set a bad example. I don't believe they do. I believe they set a human one. The law was never meant to be blind to reality. It was meant to serve it. On the other side of that day was a very different lesson. The woman who walked into my courtroom believing money could insulate her from accountability learned something difficult and unavoidable. Power without humility is fragile. It cracks under pressure. Watching that realization take hold wasn't satisfying. It was sobering. I didn't feel triumphant when the agents stepped forward. I felt the weight of consequences settling where they belonged. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't celebrate. It simply arrives. People often ask me how I stay calm in moments like that. The truth is, calm comes from clarity. When you know why you're there, when you know what you stand for, the noise fades away. That day reinforced something I've believed my entire career. Respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. You can walk into a courtroom with nothing but a cane and still command respect. Or you can walk in with everything money can buy and leave with none of it. 2 months after that day, I received another letter. This one wasn't from federal custody. It was from the veteran's wife. She wrote about how much it meant to her husband to be treated with dignity. She wrote that he kept talking about how he felt seen. I sat quietly in my chambers and read it twice. Feeling seen matters. A year later, when I heard about the scholarship and where the recovered money had gone, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because something good had grown out of accountability. That's the part of justice people don't talk about enough. Justice isn't just about closing cases, it's about opening possibilities. I still get up early every morning. I still drink my coffee strong and black. I still walk into the courthouse at 8:15, and I still believe, after all these years, that the law is the great equalizer when it's applied with fairness and humanity. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her, or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. someone who believes that character matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.